We're going to get started, and thank you all for joining. I'm Ashley Consolo, and I'm the director of the Labrador Institute, and we just have the immense pleasure of welcoming some of our colleagues and of course, the infamous Rob Greenwood, and the Population Project representatives who've been here for the whole day. We've had 2 wonderful sessions already, and then there's this one, and we have a session this evening starting at 7 o'clock to look at aging populations in senior care and transitional opportunities. But right now we have a wonderful and very timely and very pressing presentation of results that are very important to our community and very important to living in Labrador, and a really excellent opportunity that we have to provide feedback before the final reports go through. And so these are really dynamic presentations where there's a discussion of what's been found and then a lot of opportunity for feedback and input and change. So I'd like to welcome up my colleague, one of the very first people I met on the St. John's campus, because he got to me before I started.
Always.
As he does, yeah. And anyways, it's my pleasure to have you in Labrador, as per usual, Rob. So I'll turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you all. Some of you suffered through this introduction in the last session, but we're delighted that we had a changing of the guard with the different topics. So some folks have interest in jobs that relate to both topics, and others one or the other. So that was the intent here today. So the Harris Center has been around 14 years now, and we have a mandate that cuts across all the campuses and units at the university to help facilitate, coordinate connections between faculty, staff, and students with the needs of the province. Of course, in Labrador, we always partner with the Labrador Institute and have several initiatives we're working on together. So this project, the Population Project, has been on the go for 5 or 6 years when our advisory board, Tim McNeil with the Nunavut government is a member of the Harris Center Advisory Board, and they felt that there were a whole bunch of big issues in the province that really needed us to try to find the funding and put a team together to do work on that topic to help inform policy and practice. And the key kind of area that pulled together most of the priorities they identified was on demographic change. Because we all know with the aging population, with the drop in fertility rates, with the trend overall of rural to urban migration, a lot of impact on the economy, on social services, healthcare, and so we wanted to have an ongoing research project on that. Dr. Keith Story, former head of geography, agreed to come on as the director of the Population Project. He's done a lot of work himself in the area, particularly on the long-distance commuting work over the years. And then we finally got some funding together, the first significant amount from the International Grenfell Association for work that would be done on the project for Labrador and the top of the Northern Peninsula. And we've got some other funding in place from some private funders. And we have another commitment from a foundation once we get the full budget in place. So we have a proposal into the Provincial government now, Advanced Education Skills, which we're pretty sure we'll get. So we've done, well, I'm going to let Keith say a little more about the project. But maybe before we do that, we should do a quick round table. Also, welcome to the people who are viewing. We're live streaming. And thank you for joining us. And so Jamie, who's moving the camera, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jamie Jackman. I work at the Labrador Institute. I'm the program coordinator responsible for research, promotion, and outreach.
Super. Thank you, Jamie.
I'm Morgan Mills. I'm also a program coordinator at the Labrador Institute.
And I'm actually the director of the Labrador Institute.
Julian Griffin, director of economic development with Canada. Robin Goodfellow-Bakey, from West River.
And that's all the notes that asked the question for the panel at Happy Valley-Goose Bay.
Chris Burden, Senior Analyst with Labrador Affairs Secretary.
Donnie Burden, Constituency Assistant for NHA Perry Trooper.
Jeanette Fox, I'm a social worker with Newfoundland and Labrador Housing. Matthew Don with the Labrador Institute.
Trevor Kennedy, Development Officer with the COLA.
Alvin Sims, Department of Geography, and the Harris Center Regional Analytics Lab.
I'm Chris Aubrey-Bassler with the Primary Healthcare Research Unit at the University.
I'm Stefan Jewczyk. I'm the presenter for the housing project for the Harris Center.
Keith Story, I'm the director of the Population Project for the Harris Center.
Just let Keith keep talking for a few minutes now and tell you more about the project. Thanks for coming.
First of all, thank you for coming. The Population Project, as Robert said, is designed to essentially focus on policy and development issues arising from demographic changes that we anticipate will occur over the next 20 years in this province. It's different from the population growth strategy that the previous Conservative government introduced in 2015. Their emphasis was on having more babies, retention of people within the province, and attracting immigrants, all of which are important. But the focus of this particular project is how can we do at least as much, if not more, with less? And by the less, I mean fewer people in total, fewer people in the workforce, and fewer dollars. So we're very much looking at the way in which we can change things. And one of the issues that came up in discussion back in 2015 was that housing is a key issue within Labrador. But, and there's a but, housing issues in Lab West are not the same as on the Straits, is not the same as on the North Coast, are not the same as in Happy Valley-Goose Bay. We only have so much money, resources, and as well, people and money. So what we decided to do was to focus on Happy Valley-Goose Bay. And the reason for that, in part, came out of the first pieces of work that we commissioned, which were demographic projections for Labrador, and then we did another one for the province as a whole. And Alvin Sims and Jamie Ward, his co-worker, they developed a series of projections for Labrador in which we saw some significant declines in population in the Straits and the coastal areas, but there was potential for growth here in Happy Valley-Goose Bay, mostly as a result of in-migration, but growth in population overall. And so we decided to focus our resources on this area here. And the way in which we run these projects is to identify the project and then go look for somebody or bodies that have the skill set to be able to look at this, rather than just putting out an open call for research proposals. And in going the way that we did, Stefan Jewczyk, and Stefan used to be the Director of Planning for the City of Mount Pearl. He's had a significant involvement in homelessness issues over the years. We asked Stefan if he would take on this project to look at housing in the Happy Valley-Goose Bay cluster. He'll explain what he means by that in just a moment. And there's no doubt in my mind that it's an issue now. It's going to be interesting to see how that issue changes over time. And I think the best thing to do is to let Stefan tell us something about that, and to offer some recommendations to policymakers at different levels of government and different organisations as to what we might do about that. And the idea is that Stefan will present his findings and look for feedback from you on those findings, and what we will do is to incorporate, or he will, incorporate changes into the report which he's prepared, and then ideally that will be released in the next few weeks. But anyway, it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce Stefan. Some of you, I'm sure, know him already, but let's give him a nice welcome. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Keith said, I'll just give you a little bit of my background. I'm a professional planner. I've been planning for the past 40 years. I was a town planner with the St. John's Metropolitan Area Board, and in 1989 became Director of Planning and Development for the City of Mount Pearl. As Keith said, I've had a lot of involvement in the housing and homelessness sector. Currently, I'm one of the directors with the Housing and Homelessness Network. And a lot of those members are actually at a conference right now in Gander, and I'm certainly pleased to be here to give some background on the report findings to date. And as Keith said, I do look forward to the feedback that you can provide in terms of what I've experienced, what I've heard, and what I've reported on. So basically, this is which I'll go through very quickly, the objectives, the importance of the study, and really Keith has already kind of gone over that. The research methodology, I'm going to give a very quick overview on population. Of course, that's important in terms of population and its forecasts, and then resulting housing situation, and then finally recommendations. I'm hoping to spend most of my time on the last part, the housing and recommendations. So what is the Happy Valley-Goose Bay cluster? Well, as Keith said, this is really started off as a housing demand supply study for Central Labrador. A lot of work was done by RenLab and the Harris Center on the area of Central Labrador region. But we concentrated on the Happy Valley-Goose Bay cluster, which really consists of Happy Valley-Goose Bay, West River and Sheshatshiu, because there is a real dynamic between those three communities. They're in close proximity to each other. There's a real degree of interrelationship between the three. And as we all know, Happy Valley-Goose Bay is the hub of Labrador. It is the regional center. It's identified as a regional town center in the work that RenLab is doing. So it'll have a very big significance in this area. Lastly, it is also an area in which there's a lot of migration from the surrounding communities, and that creates another dynamic, as we all know, in terms of accommodation, shelter, and housing. The objective of the study, very quickly, understand the current environment, evaluate the future housing needs, identify gaps or shortfalls, and then recommend policies and programs. The importance of the study, Keith has really gone over very, very well. We do have a young and growing Indigenous community throughout Labrador, and particularly in this area. As is most cases in Labrador, there's an aging population, especially in two of the communities. There is volatile changes as a result of mega projects. That creates a real impact on housing. And what has happened is that the appropriate affordable housing demand, the demand for housing exceeds supply. Housing quality in many respects leaves much to be desired. And given what we know right now and what's likely to happen based on the information from the Harris Center, is that conditions will likely be exacerbated given the anticipated change over the next 20 years to 2036. So really the importance of the study is what planning is in place for the demographic change for housing. The approach basically was we took the population information from RenLab, and we prepared a housing forecast model, or they prepared a housing forecast model based on a historical survival model. That was projected into 2036. I then took a look at housing indicators that I could find on the area, and I think the word I could find is a kind of a theme through the presentation, and that there's a lot of discussion about housing and the needs and so on, but there's really very little information and data that's being collected publicly to give a sense of what the housing situation will be in the future. I'll get to that shortly. So, the housing indicators to look at, of course, is housing type, housing age, household formations, those kind of indicators. Did a literature and policy review across the country and provincially and locally to see what were the current trends, what were the current policies, and their relevance to the Happy Valley-Goose Bay cluster. I did a series of telephone in-person interviews, and then I did, as I hear, a community consultation session on March the 2nd, 2018. All that information, of course, is in the draft report, and really form the basis of everything that came forward. A quick overview of the population. This is the population in 2016. In the cluster of those three communities, we have about 9,600 people, of which Happy Valley-Goose Bay, of course, is the most predominant community in the cluster, being the hub at 8,109, followed by Sheshatshiu, and this is Sheshatshiu, proper Sheshatshiu. This is information from Stats Canada. When I say proper, this is within the boundaries of Sheshatshiu, because there's actually two statistical analysis of Sheshatshiu. One is within the boundary, and then there's the surrounding area that Sheshatshiu is presently expanding into. This is the community boundary, and then there's Northwest River at 547. In terms of how they look in terms of age structure, and while the scales are different for each of these pyramids that you see here, population pyramids, they do tell stories for all three communities. If you look at Happy Valley-Goose Bay, the population pyramid, that's very indicative of a good economy and a working economy. You take a look at the age cohorts, and you can see the grouping between ages basically of 25 up to 65, that bulge, and that's really, I'm going to say, the working group, the working class. So you can see it's got a good economy. You go to Northwest River, on the other hand, you do see a much smaller pyramid, an inverted pyramid, almost a younger age. But then in the age group of 50 to about 70, you'll see a large group of aging individuals. And of course, this is indicative of the aging nature of the communities. Sheshatshiu, on the other hand, very interestingly, is a very young population. The age structure there, majority of the age there is under 30, and a significant age structure in the community. And so they have a very different housing need versus Happy Valley-Goose Bay versus Northwest River. All three have different needs. But Sheshatshiu particularly, young population requiring different type of housing needs versus Happy Valley-Goose Bay and Northwest River. In terms of continuing population, this is the population projection done by the Harris Center. You'll see what's being predicted is, you look at 2016, this is for the Central Labrador region, 10,222 people, going up to 10,614 in 2026, and then a slight decline from that period to 2036 of 10,425 people. And that's on the basis of the information that they have. Interesting enough, looking for other population projections, going back to information available, I could not find anything other than this information. There is some in the Happy Valley-Goose Bay Municipal Plan that provided some information, but didn't extend as far as the study area in this project. But what's interesting is the lack of information out there. The other thing that the work indicates is that the population is aging. Average age 2011 is 35. Average age 2026 forecast is 40. 2036, 44. So that will all have implications, both the rise of the population in this Central Labrador area, which is what we have in terms of projections, and then a slight decline after 2026, and an aging population continuing throughout the whole period up to 2036. Going into housing, this is what it's like in 2016. There's right now a total of 3,797 units, dwelling units in the cluster. Of course, the most predominant one is Happy Valley-Goose Bay, which has 3,271 units versus Northwest River at 277 and Sheshatshiu at 249. Now, the interesting part, going back to that, is if you remember the population count, Sheshatshiu has more population than Northwest River, but Northwest River has more dwelling units than Sheshatshiu. So you can see there's an issue of a number of people per household in the two communities. One, Sheshatshiu has a lot more than Northwest River. In terms of the housing characteristics of the housing mix, predominantly in the cluster, they're single-family dwellings. I think we all are very much aware of that. Happy Valley-Goose Bay, however, has a greater variety of housing types. Still predominantly single-family dwelling and single-family, other attached single-family type structures. There is some semi-detached development and some row housing, but again, predominantly it's a single-family, low-density residential area. And if we drive around, it's very obvious to all to see. In terms of average household size, and this kind of goes back to my earlier comment about Sheshatshiu, you'll see that in Canada, the average household size is at 2.4. For Newfoundland and Labrador, it's 2.3. In Happy Valley-Goose Bay, it's 2.6, which is just above the Canadian average. So there's, there's larger family household size in Happy Valley-Goose Bay. Interesting enough, and then you look at the household size for Northwest River and the aging population, it's at 2.2, which is below the Newfoundland and Labrador average and the Canadian average, which makes sense because probably a lot of the younger families have now have moved out or have got other homes as well. So you're having a slightly older population. The very significant piece of this, of course, is Sheshatshiu, that almost has 2 times the average household size of both Newfoundland, Labrador, and Canada. Of course, this is an indication of the overcrowding concerns in Sheshatshiu. So forecasted housing demand. So what this chart actually shows 2 things. One is the growth in overall housing, and this is the bars. So you'll see a growth of from in 2016 to just under 3,750 homes in the area, up to just below 3,950 in 2021, and 2026 it's just under, just over 3,900, and in 2036 below 3,800. This is based on the population projection. So basically, it's a straight line projection following what the population projection is. The numbers you see in each of those bars is an indication of the number of single-family dwellings, which is a predominant form of housing, that would make up the housing demand forecast over that period of time. So in 2016, right now it's 2,780. They'll rise in 2021 to 2,932 single-family dwellings, 2026 to 2036. So a very small change between 2021 to 2026, and then you'll see a decrease down to 2,850 in 2036. So the indication of this piece of work, and there's more information to support this in the report, is that you're going to see housing growth up to a certain point in the period between 2021 and 2026, and then a decline in the need for that housing demand. So if that's the case, the question becomes, what will be the impact on the housing stock that is currently there if there's less of demand for housing within the cluster? And that's a big issue. The question becomes, is there anyone talking about that change? Is there anything being planned for a change that is anticipated to occur around that time? The one piece of information I did find, and this is the housing starts for Happy Valley-Goose Bay, and this is unpublished information that I was able to get from CMHC, and this does show the number of housing starts that they've collected over a period of time, up until actually this information I received last year. You'll see really that there's been a significant change right at the end of this bar chart, that as of 2012, the number of housing starts based on the data that they've collected has began to decline, and even more so in 2014 and certainly in 2015. So what this slide gives an indication of is the change in housing starts as a result of the moving beyond Muskrat Falls. The boom period seems to be over in terms of housing demand, and is beginning to go on a decline. And this is the information, again, it's unpublished, but I thought it was of interest. It's the only piece I could find really that gave a long-term perspective of the housing starts for Happy Valley-Goose Bay over a period of time. So in terms of this, the information that I was able to get through the research and with the public consultations and the interviews is, first of all, there is very little housing information available. What is available tends to be information from Stats Canada. It tends to be information that is available up to that point in time, but there's really no housing projections that really move beyond those periods. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of anecdotal expectations what's going to happen, but there's nothing that's evidence-based in terms of what is going to be a predictable projection in housing. Again, Alvin has done work on this for this project, and I really could not come up with finding any other information in terms of housing projections over the next number of years. So really the peak employment seems to have now passed, but yet, as we all know, housing prices and rental rates remain high. Interesting enough, having said that, I'm talking locally about the perspective about the future of this region, of this cluster, of where things are going, and how do you see your future in terms of growth. It's a very optimistic future. People see, that I talk to, see this area continue to grow. I don't agree with some of the projections that I just shared with you here in terms of a growth up to 2026 and then a slow decline. And they point out things like, Voisey's Bay Underground, perhaps more work in the Muskrat Falls, another future phase potentially, other resource projects, the link. These are all kind of on the horizon, and there's a lot of optimism that a number of these or some of these will continue. The information that was derived for this project was based on what we know at this point in time, and not kind of look at the future in terms of speculative potential growth. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of optimism about ongoing growth here, and that then kind of colors the way you view the housing demand and what type of housing you need in the future. If you see it continue to grow and grow at a very high income type of level, then your housing needs or views will be different than if you see a decline and less economic wealth within the community. Now, having said all that, while there's little planning for the future housing needs in this area, there's a recognition of an aging population in Happy Valley-Goose Bay and Northwest River. Through a number of interviews and the consultation, that was readily identifiable. And secondly, there's major housing demands for a young population in Sheshatshiu. That was very clear. The supply right now is not keeping up to demand. There's an overcrowding problem at this point in time, and you look at the demographic I showed you earlier in the pyramid, that's going to grow because that very young population, which is average age is somewhere around the low 20s for the whole population. And you know that there's going to be a real demands on housing for that young population in the very near future. The other thing that came forward from the consultations and number of interviews, provincial housing policy, as it is today, is not regionally sensitive. There needs to be more flexibility in the policy so that it can really respond to regional situations, regional changes. As I think someone said at one point, that the provincial policy is a policy of one for all, but doesn't really look at the local nature of some of the issues that are happening within the area itself. There's little coordinated effort. This came through in the consultations. Little coordinated effort between levels of government and communities. Everyone has a view of the housing situation and what we may be able to do for it. There's really very little collaboration and effort between levels of government and communities in addressing it in a much more holistic manner. There has been, the government has been involved with community groups, but there's not really a full coordinated effort in terms of looking at the overall picture of housing. Certainly, as we all know, and I've heard time and time again, there's a lack of affordable housing choices in the cluster. And it was interesting, I was showing last night the front page of the Labradorian, and we're telling about housing choices, about affordable housing choices, and there's a couple there are looking to get into NLHC housing, and there's issues in them getting into it. And that is kind of indicative of the affordable housing choices that are here. There's very little appropriate studio or one-bedroom dwelling units available within this marketplace, and that's significant because you have a lot of young professionals, a lot of seniors that they may be single, and you have a lot of single individuals that are here for medical or social reasons, that there's no appropriate small dwelling units available to them. Most of the development that's gone on over the past number of years has been market-driven. It's been market-driven for higher income individuals. As a result, this is an area that needs a lot more attention as we go forward, regardless of the population dynamics in this area. A real need for tinier homes, one-bedroom units that really provide adequate shelter for those that require that type of shelter. The biggest discussion I had through this, and of course I'm probably partly to blame as well because I'm involved in this area as well, is the whole area of social housing and homelessness. There's a great demand in this, certainly in the town of Happy Valley-Goose Bay, to deal with things like demands on emergency shelters, transitional housing, supportive housing, and subsidized housing. This is a magnet for a lot of people to come to Happy Valley-Goose Bay for the services it offers, for its environment. I know recently there's been a committee set up regarding the transient population issue that has occurred over the past number of years. This seems to be the biggest area of discussion by the community, is these housing and homelessness issues. There's been more discussion I've been hearing than it has been the supply of housing in the future, although this is part of the equation. This seems to be a real big issue. What's lovely to see is there's many community organizations that are attempting to respond to the need. Not only community organizations, but nonprofits. I know government is trying to respond as well. The problem is that quite often it's not coordinated. And secondly, as someone said, we may have too many organizations chasing the same kind of funding availability that lessens the potential effort in getting appropriate funding for the housing that's required. Moving on to recommendations. Of course, the first one is that all levels of government need to be proactive in planning and collaborating in a local response to the housing needs of an aging population within this cluster, and they need to do it in a comprehensive, integrated, and supportive manner. So that's just a general recommendation all around. A nice motherhood recommendation, but indeed that is a very strong recommendation. It needs to be more planning and collaboration. The beautiful piece of having said that is that there are in my view, two great opportunities that are occurring right now across the country and here in the province. One is the National Housing Strategy. The National Housing Strategy that's been introduced recently by a Liberal government, it's about, I guess, 2.5 years old now, is really a very comprehensive housing strategy that deals with all aspects of the housing market. It's probably the most comprehensive one I've seen in all the literature on federal initiatives since the early days. There's a lot of funding or a lot of investment available to put into these programs. And three of interest in terms of the work I'm doing is, the first one is really doing with addressing gaps in housing market information and data. CMHC, who I said I got that information on Happy Valley-Goose Bay, that unpublished information, they do not do an annual report on housing, nor do they do any projections on housing for any area that's less than 10,000 people, a community of 10,000 people. This is a real problem because you don't get the information you need to be able to take a look at the market, how the market's responding, and what the issues are to address housing issues. And I know my experience in the St. John's area, and that's all I can speak to directly, is that CMHC does this work. They do it on an ongoing basis, And what happens is they do have meetings with the local builders, the developers, and municipalities, and they will tell you, basically, this is the area where housing has occurred, and these are the areas that there's a housing need based on the past 5 years of research, or 10 years. With that information, you'd be surprised how quickly the private sector will respond to actually build that kind of, I'm going to call it niche housing. St. John's, it happens all the time. You go through cycles now, everyone's building condos. Now the cycle is building rental accommodation. The reason they're doing that in those cycles is because they are getting that information and they're making their business judgments based on that data. Right now, that data is not available in any kind of ongoing basis through CMHC for this area, for this region. So in addressing gaps in housing market information and data, that needs to change to allow for that information to be collected in areas with less than 10,000 people, especially in areas that are under population housing pressures. That to me, I think, is essential. The second strategy is that's in a part of the strategy, I should say, has to do with the surplus lands that the federal government has. In the National Housing Strategy, they've talked about doing work to identifying surplus federal lands and then passing that land, once it's identified that surplus to federal needs, pass that land over to community or community groups for community-based affordable housing programs. To me, that makes a lot of sense. I know, again, back in the St. John's area, the Pleasantville area, they're redeveloping all that for a lot of affordable housing, very much based on this approach. If there could be a long-term plan developed for Counter Forces-based Goose Bay, and determination of what they really need to continue their operation. If they identify that they end up any surplus land that's in close proximity to Happy Valley-Goose Bay in terms of development, this would be an ideal opportunity to transfer land for community-based affordable housing programs. And it is a transfer. It is not a matter of it's market-driven. They will transfer land on that basis. On the other side, the municipalities got to be prepared, or community groups be prepared to invest in the land to be able to build the type of housing that's required through whatever federal or provincial programming is available for funding. Third piece is a whole piece on housing for First Nations, Indigenous organizations. And this is based, they call it the Distinction-Based Housing Program. And unlike in the past, this program is now putting the planning process, giving it to the First Nations and say, you decide what your community needs, you decide what your housing needs are, your infrastructure needs, and so on. And once you've done that, in collaboration with the federal government, we will then be able to be in a better position to provide you funding and investment to meet those needs. Very different approach from the past, where basically the federal government just gives an envelope of money to say, this is what you're going to be allocated this year for whatever program. But one of the issues I heard is that that's a real problem for Sheshatshiu, in that they only get so much money and is not meeting their needs in terms of supply of housing for the community. Provincially, the second great opportunity. The provincial government is in the process of developing a provincial housing plan. It's been in the works for the past 2 years or 2.5 years. It was part of the government review of NLHC. And the first step was to take a look at NLHC in terms of its corporate environment and its efficiencies. Once that was done, the intention was now to move on with the provincial housing plan. They've done the first step. Now, the mandate letter to the minister is that this is a top priority to do. Given the fact that we now have a comprehensive national housing strategy, if this provincial housing plan could be tied in and dovetailed with that strategy, which I believe is probably the intention, that should provide for really good housing opportunities and investment in this area. One thing, though, that the housing plan has to do provincially, which in the past it really hasn't addressed, is address housing policy in both public and private sectors. The last plan, or last policy that was done for the province, it was sort of simply called the Social Housing Plan, and it was just the public social sector, right? It was not really based on a private public housing sector. Because the private sector can do a lot towards affordable housing and responding to need, but they need to have policies in place that guide them. The housing plan should be sensitive to regional needs. Lastly, there should be a collaboration between the Housing Corporation and Municipal Affairs and the Environment. The Housing Corporation provides programming. The Department of Municipal Affairs and Environment, they have a great tool under the Urban Rural Planning Act called Provincial Land Use Policy. And if you can combine the programming, saying we need affordable housing, with land use policy that says for all new development, and here's an example, all new development, 10% of what you're going to build will be affordable housing units based on this criteria, and that's the policy across the province. You've got two programs that are working hand in hand in addressing a housing need. Currently, what happens is the Housing Corporation does what they do, and there's no provincial land use policy, and municipalities, for the most part, are really working on their own, trying to meet the local needs without getting a lot of direction provincially. I think this will be a great opportunity here. One area I believe they need to examine as well is rental regulation in areas that are experiencing rapid growth in the housing shortages. This is actually occurring in 3 provinces at this point in time. And what I mean by rental regulation is that rents, there's a certain percentage of rents may be able to go up and on an annual basis. So it provides some certainty to those that are renting homes, that they're not suddenly going to get a quick spike in their rent, and they now have to move out and look for rental accommodation elsewhere, and they can't find it because they can't afford it. Also, what the rental regulation will spur additional building in the affordable housing area to provide more rental accommodation in that particular marketplace. Lastly, in terms of provincially, municipal affairs, in my discussions with them, I could not find a planner that was actually involved with planning for communities in Labrador. As part of budget cuts and people moving out of the department, they have no one involved directly. That is a problem because you need professional planners that can provide advice and guidance to communities. I understand since having a chat with them that they now have got an ad up looking for planners, a senior planner in that department, who I understand is going to be responsible for Labrador. At the municipal level, one thing I thought was interesting is that everyone believes that they can deal with housing in their own particular community at their own level, and really in this cluster it's so closely tied together in terms of the implications for housing and population movement here, that really there should be a regional housing study done between the 3 communities. I think it'd be much more effective in dealing with the various demands, because they do actually impact, especially on Happy Valley-Goose Bay from the Northwest River and Sheshatshiu. The regional housing study should develop projections for this region, and from all aspects of the housing continuum, which is really from emergency shelter through to social housing, through to market housing. So we should look at all of that and begin to develop and monitor the information and the projections needed to provide the housing response. The cluster should also have regular forums to collaborate and address mutual issues and needs in the areas of land use and infrastructure planning, housing, and community services. In terms of the actual, as a planner, of course, now begin to look at policy and regulation within the municipalities themselves. The Happy Valley-Goose Bay Plan, Northwest River Plan, both have got very low density policies. They're very exclusionary, and that basically means one type of use or very limited types of use within the residential zones. And within the commercial zones, excluding kind of residential uses. As part of the plan and development regulation reviews, and I know Happy Valley-Goose Bay just set up an RFP on this, what they need to be looking at is really begin to change the nature of their zoning and their plan policies to be much more inclusive, allow a bigger range of housing within each of those designations and zones, not just single-family dwellings, but single-family dwellings, double dwellings, triplexes, and get a mix in there, and allow in your commercial zones a lot more housing units. There's a lot of commercial development that's compatible with housing. And you'll be surprised if you allow that mix, the creativity and what comes forward in developing a lot of housing, and especially in the commercial zones, you will get a lot more of the housing, that kind of small unit development that's required for singles in the community. So this is this would be certainly as a recommendation to Happy Valley-Goose Bay, and I know that someone here from there, that'd be someone I would recommend very strong in terms of looking at. The other piece, given the change in the population, the fact that at one point we may have a lot of housing available that may not be needed in terms of large single family dwellings, in the policies and the regulations, there's got to be some allowance for conversions from single family dwellings to multi-unit dwellings. You may have a single family home that could be divided very nicely into 2 or 3 units. And it will not increase traffic or density within the residential areas, but provides the opportunity for any change that results in not needing more units, but having existing units there that may not be able to be occupied, be able to have a conversion to something that's much more in response to the market. The last thing, I think that's the last thing I've got, no, the second last thing, is that the regulations talk about minimum floor areas. Minimum floor areas are great for maintaining a certain size house in an area, but they're terrible in terms of trying to create more housing choices and smaller houses that respond to the need for affordable housing. If those minimum floor areas were taken, you'd be surprised how quickly the private sector will come forward and begin to build smaller houses that really respond to affordable housing demand. And in their view of affordable housing, is not social housing, it's just housing at a lower cost to the public. But they will respond, if you take that minimum floor area out, you'd be very surprised. The housing policies have to reflect public and private investment, not just public investment in these plan reviews. Like I say, Happy Valley-Goose Bay just sent out an RFP. West River is sending theirs out in 2020, so we're getting close to that. And both towns have recognized the need for updating housing policy. And there needs to be housing policy in those plans, not residential land use policies, but housing policies, as I've talked about in terms of the continuum of housing here. Happy Valley-Goose Bay, they currently have a vacant position, municipal planner. I would have recommended to hire that planner prior to proceeding with the plan review. I know that's already started without the planner. The importance of that is if you have the planner there right now as a review starts, that planner understands the context in which that plan has been developed and can move things forward rather than coming in after the fact and trying to learn why you're doing what you're doing in your plan policy and your regulations. And lastly, that planner should be responsible for tracking and the projection of housing demand and preparing a similar study for the town itself. And that's kind of where I am right now with the work. So, hope I haven't gone too long. Keith?
Thank you. Well, those are some of the findings that Stefan has offered you. What are your feelings? Are there things that have been missed? Are there things that you would think need to be emphasized more than others? Are there differences of opinion? What are your reactions to some of the things that Stefan has had to say?
And for people viewing online through the wonders of modern technology, Ashley and Jamie got it working so they can email in questions. I think you click on the bottom of the screen, and Ashley will let you know when she has one from someone.
Good, thank you.
Would there be anywhere else in the province that would compare to the 4.5 per household in Sheshatshiu? Or would that be the highest?
I can't tell for sure. I didn't compare that to other parts of the province.
Not really. Yeah, maybe not even Con River, I don't think has a number that high.
I don't think there's anywhere that's has rates.
Yeah, like this. North Coast of Labrador has higher rates as well, I think. But I think that's about the only places that I know of.
Yeah, I know the people that the representatives from Sheshatshiu I talked to, that was the first thing they talked about, was the overcrowding. They actually talked about two things, the overcrowding and the concern for general health and well-being in those household formations, because quite often they may have someone that may have a problem, and that problem spills out right throughout the whole family, and creates problems just for the family grouping there, especially for young children. So quite a big concern by the Sheshatshiu representative, right?
Actually, I do have a question, maybe they'll start a debate. What is the biggest hindrance to having this type of housing for young people, like you say, studio apartments and all this other stuff? Because there's going to be a lot of housing stock around here, that's going to be empty down the road. But what is impeding it right now?
Well, I think part of it is, and I don't know if I can respond to it somewhat. Part of it's probably just the regulations that are in place now in terms of changing the nature of the dwellings into converting them into smaller units. Right? People tend to move into a neighborhood based on what they believe is their kind of neighborhood. Bigger homes, a lot of trees. People have a lot of opposition to changing the way they view their neighborhoods, and they always see change as being detrimental to them. But the reality is, quite often you can make change in these neighborhoods, and people don't recognize it. So really, it's more the regulation in terms of allowing it. Do you have any comment on that?
That's a good question. At the town, we see a lot of applications for subsidiary apartments. Maybe not as much as we have in the past now, but they still come through, and they're typically the sort of ones where people want to split up a section of their home to build a one-bedroom or a studio type place, or oftentimes put one in their basement. But it's generally all in kind of single, well, they're all pretty much in single dwelling homes. I think the challenge there is that it kind of relies on individual property owners to create these apartments within their own, take a part of their house and create these apartments. And that's not necessarily always a great way to satisfy demand. I think, honestly, the biggest hindrance is the fact that most buildings in this town are not built as apartment dwellings. I think I might live in like the one real true apartment dwelling in town, because everything else are like road houses or double dwellings or like somebody's basement. So yeah, I think there's just nobody is considering about building an apartment complex.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because again, going back to these sessions that CMHC does, one of the big areas that builders are now looking at least in our side of the province, is a whole issue of accessible universal design buildings. Coming back to what and this is for seniors. This is for like kind of the aging in place process. So rather than having, very simply, rather than having a house that the builder builds 5 steps to get into the house, what they're suggesting is maybe you don't need 5 steps to get into the house. You bring it down to grade, or you change the grade so that you can gently go up grade into the house, so that as you age, if stairs become very difficult, and they become actually a barrier. Like if there's a gentle grade going into your house, and it's all in one grade and no second floor, you can stay in place a lot longer. But that's something that they've talked about, and something that the builders are beginning to talk about. This goes back to sharing of information. The builders are beginning to respond to that, wider doorsteps, grade homes. The other thing, that's what he said, is that you really do need, for a lot of these units, multi-story buildings to make, first of all, economically viable. But secondly, again, going back to seniors, we're talking about an aging population. They do not want to walk upstairs, as I said earlier. If they're going to a multi-story building, they want to go into an elevator, take the elevator up to their third floor and then go into their unit. So that, you know, that's kind of some of the challenges you have, and not only here, but, you know, challenge. But policy can really begin to move the private sector in that direction.
Yeah, I guess also in that sense, and don't quote, and I, you know, don't quote me on this. I'm not an engineer. I just work with them. But I think the kind of the geography, the physical composition of the soil, given that it's all sand, you know, pretty much, you know, all the way down, creates limitations of how buildings are designed here. So hence there's a potential to be basically to build smaller dwellings as opposed to bigger ones. And I'm not exactly sure what real kind of constraints that can place on like an apartment complex or a condo or something like that, but they certainly do exist.
Yeah, there's actually evidence to support what you're saying when you have construction limitations. Because if historically you look at different places in Canada by age and dwelling type, and you look at multiple census periods, and you see no shift, and the first question comes, given you got such a high proportion of population in younger cohorts, young adults, and so on, why isn't there high density housing? Because that's what they prefer everywhere else, but yet it's not appearing here. You know, so there's either two things or three things that's causing it. Physical limitations, you say, with building a high density building. Secondly, is a policy thing, and then it's a cultural thing where you got all this single dwellings that are resistant to conversion. You know, in terms of the ownership and everything else.
Well, certainly,
right?
certainly in Sheshatshiu that's an issue because that's when they have very close family connections. You know, extent, and that generally they're, you know, they don't mind all living together. That's kind of I guess favor in many respects, but that brings other problems, right?
Yeah, and that's one thing we notice, and we look at a lot of that data sometimes and we try to figure out, you know, the impacts of this or that or whatever. And most places in this country where there are opportunities, young people live in high density housing or apartments or whatever. You don't live in, you know, single family homes.
And likewise, seniors live in high density development.
And they should.
You have the two ends, right?
Two ends, and they start to go up after 65.
Yeah.
You know, and by the time you get 75 and 80-year-olds, they're all in, usually high density housing. But you know, interesting enough, when we looked at Labrador, when we were looking at some of the stuff, when we tried to do a housing projection model, we noticed over time there was no shift in the way the demand was going, and yet there should have been a shift. You know what I mean? Like you would expect it to be there.
Yeah.
And you just answered the question.
Yeah.
Why?
Can I ask you one? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You mentioned about rent control. In New Zealand, with 3 other provinces that did that. What did they find as a result of that? I mean, did it influence? I mean, it presumably benefited the people living in those accommodations, but did it have any impact on the way that the builder community responded? As in, you know, I don't want to build rental housing because there are limits imposed by the regulations. For example, what's the?
Yeah, from what I could see, Keith, in the what I read, initially there is opposition to it by the builders, but the limits that are set in terms of the rent regulation or rent control in terms of increases, the provinces have kind of figured out what seems to be a reasonable, you know, change, and they do vary, by the way, in terms of how the economy moves and how the cost of living. That's how they're set up, and that generally initially there's a resistance, but it does change, especially when the demand for rental housing becomes very obvious. They will respond to that need as long as they get a reasonable return on their investment. That's what they're looking at. Initially, there is resistance, but it seems in those 3 provinces it's not an issue today. You know, Ontario's one, Quebec's the other one, and I believe it could be BC is the other one.
Temporary.
Well, if it's temporary, they've been in place for a while.
No, I mean, the initial reaction.
Oh, it was temporary, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Question here, comment?
Yes, I agree that seniors, need to be paid attention to. I live in a wheelchair accessible house, perfect for now. But what I see in this region is if you can live in your house, and if you have enough support to maintain it, you're okay. Or there's just a nursing home. Maybe there's some, I know in our town that there's some movement to put seniors' cottages, but I question that. I don't think meets the needs, because even if you're in a cottage, you still have to get food. You still have to go to Goose Bay to get food to cook. So I was talking to our town manager about this in Northwest River, and he said, why don't we bring an old ferry in, have it renovated, because seniors at a certain point want to be able to collect and eat and not make their own meals. They don't have a lot of big needs for where they sleep. And I think that's lacking in the thinking.
Well, certainly there's other approaches to seniors housing. I looked more at the supply, and there's things like there's co-housing where several seniors can live together in one home. They just kind of share the house. There's also improvements to home care. The senior can live in the house and they bring the service to you. Assisted living, that seems to be a lot of the thinking right now. So, because eventually what they're trying to do in their policy, which I totally support, is keep people in their homes, in their communities, in their place as long as they possibly can. So rather than coming to Happy Valley-Goose Bay for the service, maybe the service comes out to you to provide you the medical care you need, to provide the grocery service, whatever might be needed. And that's just a change in thinking as to how do you approach senior living, I guess. Of course, the other piece, and we see it around the province, a lot of developers are doing senior condos that that's basically designed for senior living, and they do a lot of the services outside of basically the unit that you're living in. Provide grass cutting, snow clearing, whatever needs to be done. The only problem with that approach, though, is that the seniors need to have, in condo living, you need to have your own board of directors. The board of directors is usually the condominium owners, and when you get older, the last thing you want is responsibility about the roof on the building leaking, right? And how you get the money to fix it. So that tends to be, I think that market has kind of come to an end in the province. But I think this other approach about bringing services to people where they live, you're hearing more of that right now, right?
It's a real market opportunity as well.
Well, and a retirement home, and I mean, if you leave your home and sell it, you have the money to pay for it.
Well, that comes back to the rental discussion, because the experience I've had is when the condo market was going great guns provincially, I was hearing from seniors that they did not want to sell their home, which generally tends to be an older home, and move into a condo, which tends to be a brand new condo, which actually costs more than the house they live in. And then on top of that, now they're paying condo fees, plus they're putting money into the reserve fund. What a lot of seniors want to do, sell their investment, sell what they've got, put it in the bank, and then as you need the money, you pay your rent. That comes back to the rental question. You pay the rent on the building, and when I want to go down south for 6 months, I can go and not worry about the house because the property management firm will take care of it. And that's more what you're seeing right now in terms of the developers beginning to think about the building of rental accommodation and project management for development for those projects, right?
In terms of more affordable places for seniors, I think in some ways, at least in my mind, comes back to better development regulations.
Sorry?
And we were looking at a proposal to put a seniors home in. But according to the current town of Happy Valley-Goose Bay development regulations, seniors home, especially like if it was for profit, would have to go in a commercial zone. Which, I mean, when I'm 80, I can certainly want to live right next to the liquor store. But in terms of finding a nice, like, a nice area of town where to place it was next to unworkable under the current regime of the current development plan. So and actually, as you mentioned, we are going to be in the process of revamping our development regulations for. So for anyone who is in the community, we will be looking for feedback over the next few months.
So in a case like that, there's two approaches you can take. You can go back to the commentary about the inclusionary zones, you know, allowing for that full range. Or if there's a concern about maybe opening up the zones too much to what might be considered incompatible development, just make senior homes discretionary use right across all zones. So if a project comes in a zone that seems, well, that's a good location, and there's nothing nearby that's going to be incompatible, and through your discretionary use process and public process, council can make that final decision saying, yeah, this is a great location for it. That's another approach you can take that actually would respond very well to situations like that. By the way, going back to zoning, early days of zoning, they really separated the uses because we were in a period where we had, and this is going back to kind of post-industrial revolution, we had uses that were like right next to very noxious, very environmentally very contaminating businesses that created a lot of problems for people living next door. So they decided to divide housing from those other non-housing uses by these zones and really separate. What's happened over the generations now is that we've got all these environmental regulations, we've got all this technology, and suddenly these things that were really intrusive and really problematic no longer really are as bad. So you can actually begin to bring those closer together, and you'd be surprised the opportunities you have, and the creativity that people have, in putting housing, commercial and industrial development together. Very surprising, right? You just take a look at, give you an example, you know, in New York, you know, all the lofts that they have down there that are in old industrial retail buildings, right? They just convert them, and actually they convert them while there's businesses still going on. So there's opportunities there. My point is, you know, things have changed since the old days, the way we did our zoning. I think the municipalities have a great deal of flexibility than they realize, I think, what their regulations are.
You mentioned with the population projections, people don't believe that it will level off and decline. Is that what you said?
Correct.
And so maybe there's something for everybody, that Alvin and you. I know when the stats came out, the projections for the Northern Peninsula and Labrador on the Northern Peninsula, the mayor of Roddickton took it as a call to action. And they did take it seriously and felt they needed to do something. But I guess here it's been so active, and you've had high rents and you've had big projects. Do people just not believe it till it's right in front of their face? Or maybe you first and then maybe Alvin.
Yeah, well, I'll just start very quickly. It's interesting, there's a great sense of optimism here. This is the regional center, this is the hub. They see ongoing major projects occurring. They see the need for government services expanding. They see the growth of the indigenous community. This is going to be, someone said, they do this almost again like a hub for those agencies, those organizations, those businesses. So there's a view of the continual growth, not this kind of growth and then slow decline. That part of it they just don't see, right? And I say they, is that I don't see any other information that indicates anything other than what the projections that Alvin and his group did, that shows projections happening.
So it might be interesting to hear Alvin and then hear from people who are here.
Okay, there's actually two models in that report. And one says if you can replace those people that are retiring, because number one, the birth rates are declining here, everything, and that's gonna continue. But if you replace the retirees, there is, in one model, you replace 100% of them, you grow here, because you got a combination of the indigenous population growing with the non-indigenous population, at being what they are. They're not having fewer kids, fertility is about 1.4 or something, or whatever for that, whereas indigenous population is a bit higher. So the historical trend means that you get cycles of boom and bust, you know, sort of thing. And you can be sure when Muskrat Falls shuts down, in 18 months' time, let's say, or 2 years, whenever that comes to a conclusion, there's going to be a big outflow and a sort of a downturn. The other thing, the assumption that Voisey Bay goes underground, there is a lot of ifs there, because Valley has a big history. Once they get the prime ore out of the place, they sell what's left to somebody else to develop. And there's suspicions in the marketplace at the moment that may happen to Voisey Bay. You know what I mean? So when we do these forecasts, we do not go on speculation. We have to go on what we see before us. What we always recommend is those models be run every 5 years, because basically at the end of the day, circumstances may change. You know, we're running these from 2016 assumptions at this point in time, the new ones that we did. Not on what happens in 2020. So if something happened in 2020, we could actually run that model, and we've done it for other studies that we worked on, that we would introduce that new burst of growth, and how that plays out into the economy. You know,
if you look at the national fertility rate drop, in fact, the only growth in the country is immigration, and it's mostly to urban, large urban. Some to, you know, and if the population fertility rates, as you say, don't turn around, worldwide, as women get more education, they have fewer kids. So the Aboriginal population still has a higher fertility rate. Is it dropping?
Yes.
And is it a big enough segment of the population?
We notice slight drops, because when we get the fertility reports, we're up to the latest ones we've seen. There's been some small drops, but it's very volatile, like it's cyclic in a way. But I mean, there is a slight decline going on there.
So with the national labor force and prospects, if Voisey Bay went underground, if Gull Island went ahead, there's lots of,
or the Laurentian Trough went ahead.
Will there be humans available to move?
Oh yeah, I mean, where there's money, there's people.
Okay.
You know,
Well, there's always been speculation in this area. I moved here in the 80s, early 80s, and it was deemed that all the activity up on the base was 5-wing. As 5-wing succeeded, so would the town. And 5-wing has decreased its personnel, its needs. It's settled out to an industry now that accommodates more of a hotel, people coming in, using it for a while, going out again. And it goes back to the point that was made earlier, that outside of that, anytime you look at a town that's a one industry town, you know, it lives and dies by that industry. And there's so much diversification here, and geographically, it is a service center. I mean, when you sit back and look at it, the hubs of government, of services to the coastal areas, seems to be, so I think there's going to be that continual optimism here, that even though there was a worry for many, many years about the base, as the numbers have gone down, I think people have come to a realization that there are enough opportunities here for business and or services to be able to, you haven't seen a big difference. Even when you talk about Muskrat Falls, there was the speculation of the big influx of population. All kinds of houses did go up. It never happened. And what housing they did was put over across the river in contained units without the job site. So you never saw this big boom of population into this area. And so, in effect, what we've seen is economic benefits, obviously some social benefits as well too, but there's also been, with the good comes the bad. But as far as a future opportunity for this town, I think most people feel that changes will continue to happen, but it will be nothing that is on a catastrophic level, from either good or bad. It's going to level out some small increases or decreases, but There's enough diversification in the economy here that it's going to survive.
But that diversification though is based on resources.
But there's a lot of resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you know what I mean?
If you're a service center,
Yeah.
for example, and take from both provincial, federal services for government, that this is what this is outside of the main centers of the St. John's, that this is the center for government services for Labrador. So you're going to continue, and there's philosophical changes in governments.
Exactly. There are scenarios that we have that it flatlines and doesn't grow, but it keeps what it is. It's self-sustaining. But there's that aging thing that's going on here. There's going to be eventually, you know, we all go to the greater glory, as they say, or whatever that means. But that bump that's coming, you know, sort of thing, eventually is going to cause a decline. You know, sort of thing, at the end of the day, no matter which way you look at it, you know, sort of thing, there's going to be a short-term thing. Now, I think in the historical model, Central Labrador doesn't go down by much more than 5% or 3% in the long term.
Really? I mean, I think
that's nothing. That's almost air bounds, right?
I think your point is very well taken. That there are elements of stability here that are not present in a lot of other communities in Newfoundland.
I look at my own family. I have 2 children. I have one that both of them have gotten their education when outside without really, I didn't speculate as to whether or not they would be back here. Depends on the opportunities and the fields that they got interested in. One is back here, working here, and another is away. Right. So I think that's a little bit of a reflection about what some of the opportunities are for people as well.
Oh no, we're not, you know, we don't deny that, and the reason why that little slight decline comes, because the way these, and they're only models, I mean, at the end of the day, it gives us an idea of where things could go. I mean, there's a cycle there of growth, you know, like it grows, then it declines, then it grows again through the cycles, you know, sort of thing.
I got a feeling the housing starts will not come back up. Morgan did a presentation maybe a year ago, Morgan, and you said the difference between the number of people per household, I think it was around 4, wasn't it, back? Remember that data set that you had? And it was around 4 people per household, and now we're at the national average. So I think a lot of the housing has been driven by being so far above so many people above the national average.
But I think the optimism that Stefan was referring to is that you know, there's a certain degree of unbridled optimism there. I mean, one of the points was that Gull Island was going to go ahead. Wow. You know,
burned our finger on that first
one.
Right.
I mean, there's realism and there's realism, that kind of thing. Your point is well taken, and one of the reasons for choosing to focus on Happy Valley-Goose Bay, the cluster, is because it's one of the only areas in the province outside the island
I'd suggest
that showed any kind of stability or potential for growth.
The transient community, the point of view of people coming in here, typically from 20 or 30 years ago, a lot of times people came to Labrador, first and foremost, to probably get some experience. And it wasn't unusual for people to move in here, get some experience for a few years, and people then would ask, well, when are you going back to the major center to get a job that you applied for in one of the larger areas? Some of us come up here and we stay without really knowing what's here. So it's one of these populations that there are consistencies and people that move around the table that I've known for years. But there's also any time that we can go into a spot and then we people that we don't know. So there seems to be a large influx and in and outgoing of people, and that's a traditional thing. It's typically there for Happy Valley-Goose Bay, going back to, of course, the military operations being here, and that's continued to happen. So I think you're going to continue to have that as well. There's less, I think, people coming in here to get experience and moving away. I think they're coming for different reasons, and maybe they're staying a little longer.
We know in this province, every place that we would classify as a regional center has more potential than any other place in the province. You know, sort of thing, right? And Happy Valley-Goose Bay is up there. It's one of the few places that we see potential growth in. You know, and that short downturn is mostly due to aging. And it's going to happen, it's going to be, you know, and then they'll end up being replaced eventually, I would assume, if the economy's going well, and then you're back to your, where you were.
Numbers really didn't decrease that much.
No.
I'd like Stefan's opinion. You spent a career as a city planner in, for much of your career, a growing suburb of St. John's. This town cluster, I would suggest, is unique in its optimism. in this province today. Because the Northeast Avalon, which has a lot going on,
Yeah.
the funk in St. John's now and the Northeast Avalon is, I mean, people think she's gone by, she's gone on average. And so housing starts, housing supply, housing models probably is the thing in North America that human psychology is most thinking about. You know, you're having your house and home and the type of house and home, and it's consumerism and it's conspicuous consumption, and it's, so how do you plan with that population projection, solid-ish stats, economic, hard to predict stuff, and psychology?
Well,
That's a $10 billion question.
How do planners deal with it?
How you do the evidence? First of all, is again, it's the historical evidence that's happened over the past number of years. You just follow the trend. So you know it's very much what's happened over the past 5 years is housing going up, is it coming down? So you measure that first, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and then the different types of housing, not just
Yeah.
just not dwelling units, but the variation in housing types and so on. You take a look at that, and then of course you do as planners. You usually do a 5-year forecast or projection, or 10 years, and really the next 5 years is what there's some definite kind of views that are happening. You put that into your forecasting model. And what you do also is that it's much more of the experiential kind of relationship you have with the development industry.
Mm.
I can tell you, when people come in my office, if we're going to have a good year next year or not. Because what happens, they come in, and if it's going to be, if they see as a good economy, they come in and it's the psychology is they're buoyant,
Mm-hmm.
they're happy, and they're putting down plans, and they know it's going to take a year to get out to there. And I'm sure Happy Valley-Goose Bay, the same thing. Things are going to happen next year, and you begin to see that happening. And suddenly, if you get no one coming into the office, or if they come into the office and they kind of say, "Boy, things are really slow."
Mm.
Well, they're telling you, and collectively they're telling you. Collectively, things are slowing down in that business. So you need that evidence, you need that data about what's happened. You need to kind of do a forecast, and then of course when you hear what's happening, you begin to make the change in terms of your forecast over the next 5 years. It's an ongoing kind of
Are
process.
building permits at municipalities online in this province?
A lot of municipalities, yeah.
Do you have that as a feed in your models? That would be a great leading indicator.
Yeah, you just follow the permits, yeah.
Yeah.
St. John's puts them on. I know we put them on. Does Happy Valley put your permits on? What?
We should.
Yeah, you don't put the name of like
No,
people.
no,
We just say
yeah.
single-family dwellings and the value, and it's a great resource. Certainly, as a research, it could be a fantastic resource if it was there.
Yeah.
But there's municipalities are moving more and more towards putting a lot of that information online that they can without the privacy issue. But really, it's not that difficult to predict what's going to happen over the next year or so.
Mm-hmm.
When you have people coming into the office. And my first question of just about anybody that comes in, a builder, how are things going? How's work?
Mm.
And people are very honest. They'll tell you, say, boy, things are terrible. I mean, this is the only thing I'm going to be doing for the next 6 months. You hear that from 2 or 3 people, there's not much happening in the economy. And the psychology too, it's very interesting. When things aren't going well, like in the St. John's area with all the provincial budget cuts and all that kind of stuff, people, you're not, even in the renovations, you're not seeing renovation permits coming through as you would normally see, right? Because people are just anxious about what the future holds, so they're holding back, right?
Do you have a sense of what the optimism is based on here in Goose Bay, given the winding down of the lower Churchill and the provincial economy?
Well, I think I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Chris. I think Chris summed up very well. I think people just have a real sense that this area is going to continue to thrive because it's viewed as being the regional center of Labrador.
Is there a particular industry that's developing? Maybe I don't know enough about it.
No, I think
other than government.
Well,
It used to be a service center.
Service,
I think
yeah.
at its core, that's what it is. And you'll see industry that may come and go, but at its core, I think that that's what people will provide geographically, just set out that way. And then you're hearing always different ideas coming forward, being northern sovereignty. Now it's becoming an issue. So is that going to be something that, because of our geographic location, that, we're going to benefit from?
I think Dave Lowe talked about the indigenous economy earlier.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's the other growth area.
That's grown hugely, and a lot of them, they buy a lot of stuff locally, and I think it'd be really interesting to do an analysis of that, because all of their economies, with the land claim agreement and with their IBA agreements, their economies have grown a lot.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of Morgan driving me around when I got here, and he was pointing out all the new businesses, indigenous businesses that have cropped up, and boy, there's been real growth in indigenous businesses here.
People are spending here, and I think that there was some stat that was given that the post office here has more packages coming in from the Amazons of this world than any other place lifted the province, or maybe Atlantic Canada.
That's money that's left the region.
Yeah. But I mean, it shows that people are spending, they feel a certain.
No, I looked at the income and stuff that was there, the new stuff that just released in January.
Psychological.
Phenomenal amount of money floating around here.
Sorry, we don't know. I mean, I take your point that we see that elements of stability here. We don't know whether projects are going to come on, whether it's Voisey Bay Underground or rare earths or whatever. Those are completely unpredictable. But one of the things that I think is much more predictable is the change in demand for housing types. And that seems to be a more important issue. And I'd ask your opinion on this. More important issue than numbers. So that, we're all very aware of the need for affordable homes for people in transitional situations and transient, and I don't want to call it social housing, but I mean that whole spectrum of housing for people in some kind of serious need. So that is an unresolved problem at the moment. And then we know that the population is aging, and so that the conversion of existing units to make them more user-friendly to older people, or the construction of new types of units for older people. I think that those are the areas where the real changes that can be anticipated, and how they can be dealt with is a question.
Services here, with an aging population, or even if you're talking about recruitment and retention, you're competing globally.
Yeah.
So if you want people to come here and stay here, they're checking out what services are available here. The recent announcement now with the wellness center, that's something that people, you're getting this, like they're looking for what's available, amenities for themselves, for their children. And as an aging population, I'm closing in on 60, so I don't want to be out walking in -30 with my dogs. I still do it, but I'm one of those rare breeds. But with a wellness center with a walking track, now all of a sudden you've got something for an aging population. They can go keep a healthy, active lifestyle. So
well, if I could just jump in there with one more point, is one of the other reports that we completed was on the whole question of attraction and retention of professionals into Labrador. And one of the biggest issues is available, not just affordable, but available housing. And affordable being the next question. And in many cases, people can't come because they can't find appropriate or housing that meets their needs. And then when they do come, they're often, and I'm not just talking about Happy Valley-Goose Bay, I'm talking about Labrador as a whole, but it applies just as much here as anywhere else, is when they do come, the quality of that housing is often just unacceptable. And so those kinds of needs, if you're going to attract and retain people, that's a key issue that needs to be addressed.
And Keith,
Sorry, go ahead.
Just very quick, and that's where CMHC when they were, the work they do, these Outlook, I think you've been to the Outlook housing stuff, that's what they're really good at. Unfortunately, they don't do it for this area.
Right.
And that's the problem, because they really track housing demand, they track employment, they track economic indicators, and coming out of all that, they can almost tell you the type of housing and almost the number of units you're gonna need in the course of the next 2 or 3 years. We don't have that data here, that's the problem, right? And that's the thing that I experienced very frustratingly is, okay, what other information is available? And once you have as a planner, once you have the information, you can then make those kind of, rational kind of forecasts, whether you're optimistic or you're not, at least you're moving in the right direction, right?
Well, we're getting to the end of the day. Is there anything that anybody feels that we haven't covered or would like to flag as being particularly important? That we'd need to.
And you can always email or contact us after.
Stefan, can I leave the last word with you? What, anything to wrap up?
Well, again, just thank you for your attention and the feedback, very appreciative. I did, my time here and my interviews with individuals I thought were very insightful, very informative. The work that I've done is, it's in kind of almost like a final draft right now, so some of the comments are made here I'll probably include in the report. But as Robert said, if there's anything more you want to add, you think about, by all means, send along to the center, and I'll be more than pleased to take a look at it. So thank you very much, and appreciate your opportunity and your time with it. Thank you.
Yeah.